The debris field did not look dangerous from a distance. It never did. From far enough away, the shattered remains of a dead world just looked like dust and shadow, hanging in the dark between stars, quiet as a grave. But Rail had been flying salvage routes long enough to know that the quiet ones were the worst kind, the ones that had stories inside them, the ones that held things the galaxy had decided to forget. He cut the Sundrel's engines to a low drift and let the ship coast through the outer edge of the field, watching the scanner feeds from his pilot's seat. His co-pilot, a broad-shouldered woman named Dara, sat beside him with her arms folded and said nothing. She had already said everything she had to say. Twice. He had listened both times and then changed nothing about the flight plan, which was the thing she hated most about working with him. The field had a name in the Accord Registry, Vrethdal Remnant Zone, Restricted. 3 years ago it had been a colony world, a Draveth colony world, full of structures and ships and life that went back further than most Accord civilizations could count. Then the border wars had reached it. Then the Accord had made a decision, and an orbital strike had made the decision permanent, and now it was a debris field with a restricted tag and a line in a report somewhere that called it a necessary action. Rail did not think about the politics of it. He was not built for politics. He was built for the practical side of things, which was why the faint biological signal that had appeared on his scanner 20 minutes ago was still bothering him. Biological signals did not come from debris fields. Debris fields had metal and rock and cold, dead atmosphere. They did not have life signs. "It is probably a sensor ghost," Dara said, without looking at him. "Probably," Rail said. He kept flying toward it. The signal was coming from a gutted Draveth warship that had drifted deep into the field, wedged between two pieces of colony structure that had fused together when they cooled. The warship was enormous even in ruin. Its hull had been split open along the port side, ribs of dark metal exposed to space, the inside of the ship visible like a body cut open on a table. Whatever had hit it hard and from close range. Rail suited up in the cargo bay, while Dara stood in the doorway with an expression that was past frustration and had settled somewhere near resignation. "If you go in there and something kills you," she said, "I am not filing the paperwork." "The signal is faint," he said, checking his oxygen seals. "Whatever is in there is not going to kill me." "That is a sentence that means nothing." He pulled on his helmet. "Keep the dock warm. I will be back in an hour." He crossed the gap between the ships on a tether line, the debris field silent around him, chunks of colony material drifting past at slow speed, some of them still trailing wisps of frozen atmosphere that caught the distant starlight and turned it pale and ghostly. He found an entry point where the hull had peeled back and pulled himself inside. The inside of the warship was dark and cold. His suit lights cut a white path through it. He moved through what had been a corridor, stepping over buckled plating and the remains of things he did not look at too closely. The Draveth had been proud of their ships. Even wrecked, the architecture had a kind of intention to it, a scale and solidity that made him feel very small. The signal was pulling him deeper, down through 2 levels of collapsed structure, through a bulkhead door that had been blown off its hinges and now leaned against the wall at an angle, into what had been a cargo hold. The hold was huge and half-collapsed on one side, but the other side was intact, and in the far corner, half buried under a sheet of fallen ceiling plating, was a stasis pod. It was a Draveth design, long and wide, built for something much larger than a human frame. It had been bolted to the wall once. The bolts had given, and the pod had fallen and wedged itself in the corner, and somehow that fall had been the thing that saved it, because the ceiling plating had come down on top of it, and the pod had held the weight, and neither had crushed the other. The power indicator was red, single-digit percentage, minutes. Rail pulled the ceiling plating off with both hands, bracing against the wall, and got it clear. He brushed ice crystals off the pod's viewport and looked through. 2 shapes, small by Draveth standards, the size of large dogs, scaled, folded wings pressed flat, one lying completely still, the faint frost of hypothermia on its scales. The other one was moving, barely. Its head came up when his light hit the viewport, and it looked at him with eyes the color of old gold, and then it opened its mouth, and he could not hear the sound through the vacuum, but he could see it was not a friendly sound. Dragon hatchlings. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Then he started working on the pod's emergency release. The aggressive one was fast despite being half dead. The moment the seal cracked, it came at the opening with everything it had, which was claws and heat, and that silent, screaming mouth. Rail took a gash across his suit's forearm that did not breach the seal, and then physically put himself between the opening and the creature, and held it down with his body weight, while he reached back with one hand and found the emergency sedation kit on his belt and got the injector against the hatchling's neck. It went still slowly, like a fire going out. He wrapped the unconscious one in his thermal emergency blanket first, because it was the colder of the two, and it was not moving, and the scanner on his wrist said its temperature was dangerously low. Then he gathered the sedated one against his chest, tucked the other under his other arm, and started back through the ship. He made it to his tether line and across the gap and through the Sundrel's dock in 41 minutes. He laid both hatchlings on the cargo bay floor and pulled his helmet off and breathed the warm ship air and felt his hands shaking, which happened sometimes after things that should not have worked out, but did. Dara was standing in the doorway again. She looked at the two small dragons on the floor of her cargo bay for a long time. "No," she said. "Their vitals are stabilizing," Rail said. "Rail, the cold one is warming up already. The thermal blanket is doing its job." "Rail, those are Draveth young. I know what they are. Do you know what their parents will do to us when they find out we have them?" He picked up the thermal scanner and checked the smaller hatchling's temperature again. It had come up 2 degrees in the last 4 minutes. The color was returning to the skin under its scales. It was going to be all right. He looked at Dara. "Get us out of the field," he said. "Slip space as soon as we clear the debris margin. I will explain everything once we are moving." "You cannot explain this." "I can try." She stared at him. Then she turned and walked toward the cockpit because she had been flying with him for 4 years, and she knew that expression. And she knew that once it was there, it was not going anywhere. Behind her in the cargo bay, the smaller hatchling stirred. Its eyes opened. They were the same old gold as the other ones, but softer, quieter. It looked up at Rail from the floor of the ship, in the warmth and the light, and it did not snarl. It just looked at him, steady and still. Rail looked back. He set the scanner down on a crate and sat on the floor of the cargo bay so he would not be looming over it, and he waited. The Sundrel's engines came to life under him as Dara brought them around. The debris field fell away behind the viewports. The smaller hatchling watched the stars shift and then looked back at Rail, and something in the quality of the silence between them changed, though neither of them had the words for what it was or even the language to try. Outside, the wreck of the Draveth warship drifted on alone in the dark. The stasis pod sat open and empty in its cargo hold. 2 lives were somewhere else now, moving forward, warm. That was all Rail had done. That was the whole of it. It would be enough to change everything. 3 days into slipspace, the smaller hatchling learned how to open the cargo bay door. Rail found out about it the same way he found out about most things on the Sundrel, by nearly tripping over the source of the problem. He came around the corner from the engine corridor with a mug of something warm and almost walked directly into a pair of gold eyes sitting at knee height in the middle of the hallway. He stopped. The hatchlings stopped. They regarded each other in the low corridor, lighting for a moment. And then the hatchling looked down at the mug in Rail's hand with an expression of focused curiosity. "No," Rail said. The hatchling looked back up at him. He sighed and walked back to the cargo bay, and the hatchling followed him the whole way, its clawed feet clicking softly on the deck plating. This was how things went for the next several days. It followed him to the cockpit and watched him check the nav charts. It followed him to the galley and watched him cook. It watched everything with that same patient, tilted focus, like it was cataloging him piece by piece. He started calling it Dwin in his head because he needed something to call it that was not the smaller one, and the name just came to him one morning the way things sometimes do, without explanation. The hatchling seemed unbothered by the name. Unbothered was, in fact, its primary mode of being. It was remarkably calm for a creature that had nearly died 3 days ago. The larger one was the opposite. Rail had set up a separate section of the cargo bay for the larger hatchling, partitioned off with some of the lighter cargo netting and a sheet of reinforced paneling he had bolted across the gap. It was not a cage. He had been careful about that. It was a space, separation with room to move. He left food inside it, nutrient blocks from the ship's emergency stores, since he had no idea what young Draveth was supposed to eat, and the blocks were at least warm protein, and water, and a thermal pad that kept the floor temperature comfortable. The larger hatchling ate nothing for 4 days. It also scorched the back wall of its space on the first night, melted one corner of the paneling on the second, and shattered a pressure indicator on the cargo bay's east wall by throwing itself at the panel in what appeared to be pure fury sometime in the early hours of the third day. Rail heard the sound and came down to find it standing in the middle of the space, wings half spread, chest heaving, the broken indicator on the floor and a scorch mark up the wall, staring at him with eyes that said very clearly that it knew what it wanted, and what it wanted was out. He looked at the damage, he looked at the hatchling, he did not say anything. He got a repair kit from the supply locker, fixed the wall panel that mattered for the ship's function, noted the other damage in his log, and went back to bed. He called the larger one Sora in his head. He did not know why that name and not another. It arrived the same way Dwin had, without ceremony. Sora, fierce one, that felt right. His other 2 crew members, a mechanic named Pol and a cargo handler named Bren, had opinions. They delivered those opinions loudly in the galley on day 5, while Rail sat across from them and listened and drank from his mug and let them finish. "We need to drop them at the nearest Accord way station," Pol said. He was a large man with a careful, methodical way of speaking that meant he had thought about everything he was about to say before he said it. "File an anonymous report. Claim we found them adrift. Walk away. The Accord will put them in a containment facility," Rail said. "That is the Accord's problem. It is their problem too." Pol pressed his hands flat on the table. "Rail, I have a family on Marat Station. Dara has a sister on the same station. If the Draveth trace these animals back to this ship, and they will, because Draveth always do, then our families are in range of the consequences." Rail was quiet for a moment. "I know." "Then you know why we are asking you to stop this." "I know why you are asking. I am not going to." Bren, who was younger and less patient than Pol, pushed back from the table with a sharp scrape of his chair. "You are going to get us all killed over 2 animals you pulled out of a dead ship." "They are not animals," Rail said, "and I am not going to get anyone killed." "You do not know that." "No," Rail said, "I do not." He looked at both of them. "I lost patience in the border wars because the order came down to retreat and I followed it. I have thought about those patients every day since. I am not looking for anyone's forgiveness for what I am doing now. I am just not going to leave something alive in the dark again because it is inconvenient to bring it into the light." The galley was quiet. Bren left. Pol stayed, looking at the table, and then he got up and left too. Rail finished his drink and washed the mug and went down to the cargo bay and sat outside the partition that separated Sora's space from the rest of the hold. He brought a reader and a work log, and he just sat there, close enough that she could see him through the gap in the paneling, and he read and he worked, and he did not talk to her or try to engage her or push the food closer or do anything at all except exist nearby. She watched him from across the space, standing, coiled, furious in the way that something is furious when it is also terrified and will not show the terrified part. He came back the next evening, and the one after that. On the 8th night, Rail was doing the late system check when the ship's audio picked up a sound from the cargo bay. He almost missed it under the hum of the engines. A low sound, beneath hearing almost, more felt than heard, a subsonic vibration that came up through the deck plating and sat in the chest like pressure. He had read enough about the Draveth in the days since to know what it was. A distress call, the kind young ones made when they woke from bad dreams in the dark. He went down. The cargo bay was dim. Dwin was asleep in the corner near the door, curled into a tight shape under the thermal blanket Rail had left there. Sora was standing in the middle of her space, trembling, not from cold. The sound was coming from her, low and continuous and terrible in a way that had nothing to do with threat. Rail looked at the partition, he looked at her. He unbolted the panel that crossed the gap, set it aside quietly and walked in. He did not approach her. He walked to the far side of the space, away from her, and he sat down on the deck, plating with his back against the wall. He turned off his wrist light, so the hold was in the same dim dark it had been before he arrived. And he sat. She watched him. The sound did not stop, but it changed, the edge coming off it slowly, the frequency shifting. She watched him sit in the dark, not moving toward her, not speaking, not doing anything at all except being there. After a long time, the sound faded. She lowered herself to the floor, not curling up, not relaxed, just down, watching him across the space. Rail stayed until the sound had been gone for a solid hour. Then he got up quietly, put the panel back, and went back to his bunk. In the morning, the nutrient block he had left inside was gone. The water was low. She had eaten. He did not make anything of it. He replaced the block and the water and went to check the nav charts and did not say anything to the crew about it. But something in the cargo bay had changed, the way the air changes before weather, a shift in pressure that had no visible sign but was real all the same. Dwin had started doing something new that week. He had watched Rail do the morning system check so many times that he had begun mirroring the motions. Not accurately, not usefully, just the shape of them, standing near the console while Rail worked, lifting his small head when Rail looked up, turning when Rail turned. Rail had started showing him things, pointing to indicators and namming them aloud, not because Dwin could understand the words, but because the hatchling responded to the act of being included, the gesture of a finger pointing at a thing and a voice giving it a name. He was teaching a dragon hatchling to read a nav console. He was aware of how this would sound to someone outside the situation. He did not care. It was on the 19th day, in the middle of a quiet stretch of slipspace transit with nothing on the scanner and the whole ship still and easy, that the comm panel in the cockpit lit up with an incoming hail. Unknown origin, tight band frequency, the kind of transmission that did not bounce off relay stations, the kind that was aimed. Rail sat down and accepted the hail. The voice that came through was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality of something that had never needed to raise itself to be heard, something that had simply always been the largest thing in any room it occupied. It said one thing. Human vessel, you carry the scent of Draveth Young. You will explain this. You will do so now. Rail looked at the comm panel for a moment. Then he looked back at the nav charts. Then he looked at Dwin, who had wandered in and was sitting beside the co-pilot's seat, watching the lit-up console with bright eyes. "My name is Rail," he said into the comm. "I am a cargo hauler. I found your young in a dead ship in the Vrethdal field. They were dying. I brought them out." Silence on the line. "Then you will stop your vessel and prepare to receive boarders." Rail reached over and put a hand on the top of Dwin's head, the way he had started doing when he walked past him, a simple acknowledgement of presence. Dwin pressed up into the touch, the same way he always did. Outside the viewport, space was full of nothing but stars, but on the long-range scanner, 3 new contacts had just appeared, holding position at the edge of sensor range. Large contacts, moving to intercept. Rail opened the ship-wide comm. "Dara," he said, "we are going to have company. I need you in the cockpits." He did not sound afraid. He was, a little, in the way a person is afraid when a door they always knew might open has finally started to move. But beneath the fear was something steadier, something that had been there since the cargo hold of the wrecked warship, since the moment he had looked through the frosted viewport and made a choice without quite deciding to. He had done the right thing. Whatever came next came from that, and he would face it the same way he had faced everything else on this trip. By showing up, by staying, by not walking away. He sat forward in his seat and waited for what was coming. The Draveth warship that came alongside the Sundral made Rail's cargo hauler look like a piece of loose debris. It was dark and long and built with the kind of weight that did not need weapons mounted on the hull to communicate what it was. The weapons were there, of course. They were just polite enough to stay folded. A docking clamp connected the two ships with a sound like a mountain deciding to sit down, and then the dock hatch opened, and Rail walked through it alone. He had told the crew to stay. Dara had not liked it. Paul had said nothing, which was worse. Bren had not come out of his quarters at all. Rail had picked up Dwin, who was not willing to be left, and had communicated this by sitting directly in front of the dock hatch and refusing to move, and he had walked through with the hatchling in his arms and Sora following 3 steps behind because she had decided, in the past day, that leaving his immediate area was not something she was prepared to do. He did not understand why and had stopped trying to. She walked where she walked. He was not her keeper. The interior of the Draveth ship was built for Draveth. The ceilings were 4 times his height. The corridors were wide enough to drive a shuttle through. Everything was dark stone and dark metal, and the occasional marking on the walls in a script he could not read, deep-carved and old-looking, some of them worn smooth at the edges in a way that said the ship had been in use longer than he had been alive. He felt very small in a way that was not threatening exactly, but was very clear about the difference in scale. He was brought to a chamber that had no furniture, just space. A floor of dark, smooth material and a ceiling lost in shadow, and the sense that the walls were very far away even though they were not. Standing in the middle of it was Vayek. Rail had looked up the Draveth High Warlord during the 2 hours between the com-hail and the docking. There was not much in the public accord database. A name, a title, a notation that he had been the primary Draveth military figure in the border wars, and that negotiating with him had been described by the Accord's own diplomatic corps as an experience that several representatives had required counseling after. There was a single image, taken from a distance, at an Accord summit 3 years before the war. He was large in the image. In person, in this room, large was not adequate as a word. Vayek was ancient in the way that certain things are ancient, not decayed, not diminished, but simply accumulated, layered with time until the weight of it was visible in the set of the body, the scarring on the scales, the eyes that had seen enough that they had stopped being surprised by most things. He was the color of deep water, dark blue-black, with gold along the edges of his scales where they caught the low light of the chamber. He stood without moving when Rail walked in, and he did not speak. He looked at Rail. He looked at Dwin, held against Rail's chest. He looked at Sora, who had walked in and stopped 2 meters inside the doorway and stood there, watching Vayek with her wings tight against her body. Then Sora moved. She walked past Rail, directly to Vayek, and stood at his feet and looked up at him. Vayek lowered his head and something passed between them that Rail could not name and did not try to. Then Sora came back, not all the way to Rail, but partway, halfway between the two of them. She stood there. Vayek watched this, and his expression did not change, but something behind it did. He began to speak, not to Rail at first, a low word in his own language directed at Sora. She answered in the same, a short sound. He said something else, a shorter sound back. Then he looked at Rail, and when he spoke again, it was in the common Accord language, slow and deliberate, and without any particular inflection that Rail could read. "Why did you enter the wreck?" "I picked up a biological signal on my scanner," Rail said. "I went to find the source." "The field is restricted." "I know. You knew before you entered." "Yes." Vayek moved then, not toward Rail, just a slow turn, a long circle that took him around the edge of the chamber and brought him back to his starting point. His eyes did not leave Rail during any of it. "The Accord's registry shows your ship as a civilian cargo hauler. You have a field medic certification. You have no military record past your service discharge 8 years ago. You have no political affiliations. You are not employed by any intelligence service." "That is all correct," Rail said. "Then explain to me your reason for keeping them." His eyes moved briefly to Dwin. "You could have sold the young to Accord intelligence. They would have paid significantly. You could have turned them over to the patrol vessel that intercepted you at the field boundary. You could have left them in the wreck and reported the signal through proper channels and let the Accord handle the recovery. You chose none of these things. No. Why? Rail thought about how to say it, not because he did not know the answer, but because he wanted to say it plainly, without embellishment, and sometimes plain things needed a moment to arrange themselves correctly. I found two living things that were going to die if I did not act. I had the means to act, so I did. Vayek looked at him. That is not a reason. It is the only reason I have. You felt no concern for your own safety, for the danger of keeping Draveth young aboard a vessel without facilities or knowledge of their needs. I felt considerable concern, Rail said. I did it anyway. Another silence. Longer. Dwin shifted in Rail's arms, turned his head, looked at Vayek with those wide gold eyes. Vayek looked back at him. Something moved in the old warlord's expression, fast and then gone, like a shadow crossing a wall. I will deliberate, Vayek said. You will remain aboard this ship while I do. He was given a room, not a cell. A room with a sleep surface and light, and a tray of food that arrived through a panel in the wall 2 hours after he was shown in. Dwin explored every corner of it immediately and then came back and sat near the door, watching it. Sora lay in the center of the floor and watched the ceiling with an expression that had less anger in it than usual. Rail ate the food, which was unfamiliar but not bad, and then lay down on the sleep surface and stared at the ceiling himself. He did not know what Vayek's deliberation meant. He did not know what verdict was possible. He was not afraid in the sharp, immediate way. He was in the steady, low kind of afraid that sits in the background and does not interfere with function, the kind he had learned to carry during the border wars when every day had a version of it. He slept eventually. Dwin lay down against his legs sometime in the night. In the morning, Rail sat up and found Sora watching him from across the room. She looked away when he met her gaze, which was the first time she had ever looked away first. He noted it and said nothing. On the second day of waiting, something happened that he had not expected. One of the Draveth warriors posted in the corridor outside his room had apparently become an object of intense interest to Dwin, who had found the gap under the door and spent 20 minutes working on it, and then emerged into the corridor to inspect the warrior at close range. Rail found out when the warrior, who was easily 3 times his size, came to the door and stood there looking uncomfortable and made a gesture at the gap under it that communicated the problem without language. Rail retrieved Dwin, apologized with a nod, and used a strip of cargo tape from his jacket pocket to seal the gap. The warrior watched him do this, watched him bring Dwin back inside, watched the whole small domestic operation with an expression that Rail could not read precisely, but which contained something that might, in a human face, have been bewilderment. Word of it reached Vayek. Rail did not know this until later. On the third night, the door opened and Vayek filled the frame of it. He looked at Rail sitting on the floor with Dwin and at Sora watching from the corner, and he came in and he stood in the center of the room, and he said, without preamble, "They are my grandchildren, the last surviving offspring of my son, who died at Vrethdal." Rail was quiet. "I was told the young died with the ship," Vayek said. "I have believed that for 3 years." The room held the silence for a long moment. "I am sorry," Rail said, "about your son." Vayek did not respond to that. He looked at Dwin, who had walked over and was now sitting at the warlord's feet, looking up at him. Vayek looked down at the small hatchling, and his face did not show the things that were moving behind it, but the things were there. Rail could feel them the way you feel weather before it arrives. Then Dwin climbed up. He put his front claws on the top of Vayek's foot, tested his weight, and began attempting to scale the warlord's leg with the calm determination of someone who has decided a thing and is simply executing it. Vayek stood perfectly still. The hatchling made it to his knee, then his thigh, then stopped and looked up and made a small sound. Vayek lowered his hand. Dwin climbed into it and turned around twice and settled, tucked, and closed his eyes. The High Warlord of the Draveth stood in a small room on his own warship, holding a hatchling the size of a dog, and for a moment the accumulated weight of him, the centuries and the wars and the grief and the pride, all of it was just a very old thing holding something very small that was warm and alive when it should not have been. Rael looked at the wall and gave him the privacy of it. After a long time, Vayek spoke. You will be given safe passage. Your crew and your ship will not be touched. The Accord patrol that logged your entry into the restricted field will find that their report has been lost in a data archive. A pause, and I will remember your name, Rael. That is more than I expected, Rael said honestly. Vayek looked at him across the room. What did you expect? I was not sure. Something worse, possibly. You saved the last blood of my line from dying alone in a cold wreck in the dark, Vayek said. The Draveth are many things. We are not ungrateful. He turned to leave. At the door he stopped, with his back to the room, and Rael could see that he was still holding Dwin in one hand and that the hatchling had not woken up. His voice when he spoke again was quieter. You are a strange species. You save things that have no claim on you. Then he walked out. Sora from her corner watched the door close. Then she looked at Rael. He looked back. She turned away first again. He was beginning to think that was her version of something. He was not sure what, but it was something. Outside the porthole of the small room, the stars were the same in every direction, patient and still, indifferent to the small strange things happening between species in the dark. The Sundral was waiting for him. He would go back to it. He would continue on. He did not yet know that the Accord was watching, or that what had just happened in this room was already more politically significant than any treaty or summit in the last decade. He did not know that Vayek had spoken to his elders by long-range comm already, and that the word he had used to describe Rael was not a word ever before used for a non-Draveth. He did not know any of that yet. He just knew that Sora looked away first, and that Dwin was warm in Vayek's hand. For now, that was enough. The news reached the Galactic Accord Central Station the same way most inconvenient news did, sideways and all at once, and from 3 different directions simultaneously, each source more alarmed than the last. The patrol vessel that had logged the Sundral entering restricted space near Vrethdal had filed its report. A Draveth long-range scout had been observed making contact with a registered human civilian vessel in unsanctioned space. Low-level intelligence flag had been quietly raised somewhere in the Accord's security apparatus when the patrol's follow-up report noted that the Draveth vessel had subsequently escorted the human ship safely to the edge of the sector and then withdrawn without incident, which was the kind of thing that did not happen. Draveth did not escort human vessels. Draveth did not, as a general practice, do anything cooperative with species they considered beneath them. The intelligence flag had escalated. By the time it reached Councillor Death's desk, it had collected 6 additional attached reports and a recommendation for immediate inquiry. Death read all of it in his private office with the kind of stillness that in his species indicated deep displeasure. He was Sorodon, a reptilian species from the Accord's founding membership, long-necked and pale-eyed, and constitutionally skeptical of anything that disrupted the order he had spent 4 decades helping to maintain. He read the reports twice. Then he opened a direct channel to Admiral Sune of the Human Accord Liaison Office. Sune was human, which Death generally found manageable. She was also ambitious, which made her predictable in the ways that mattered. He told her what the reports contained. He told her to bring the civilian in before anything became more complicated than it already was. Sune contacted Rael 4 hours later. Rael was back aboard the Sundral 2 days out from his encounter with Vayek, running a quiet route toward the Marit corridor. He accepted the comm call from a habit of answering calls, read Sune's rank indicator on the channel tag, and almost closed it again. He did not. He sat in the pilot's seat and listened to her for 6 minutes without interrupting. Sune had a voice built for official announcements, clear, measured, carrying the particular warmth of someone who had learned warmth as a professional tool. She told him that the Accord was aware of what he had done, that his actions had created a situation with significant diplomatic implications, and that with the right framing, the right presentation to the Council, what he had done could be positioned as a historic moment for human-Draveth relations and for humanity's standing in the Accord. She told him that he would be celebrated, that his name would be in the record, that humanity needed this story right now. Rail listened to all of it. Then he said, I am a cargo hauler. I do not want to be in the record. Rail, Soon said, dropping the professional warmth slightly in the way people do when they think plain speaking will work better. You do not have a choice about whether this becomes a story. It already is one. The only choice you have is whether you participate in shaping it. I found 2 hatchlings and brought them out, he said. Anyone would have done the same. There was a brief silence on the line, and when Soon spoke again, something in her voice had shifted. That is exactly the kind of thing I need you to say in front of the council. I am not coming to the council. You may not have that option. Councillor Death has opened a formal inquiry under Accord Code 7, Section 9, which covers unauthorized interaction with restricted alien materials. That includes living Draveth young. He can compel your attendance. Another silence, but this one was on Rail's side. When, he said. 14 days, Accord Central Station. He closed the channel and sat with the nav charts for a while. Dwin was in the co-pilot seat beside him, which was where he had taken to sitting since Rail had started letting him up there during routine transits. The hatchling looked at him, and then looked at the stars, and then looked back at him. In the past weeks he had grown noticeably, not in size so much as in presence, the way young things grow into the space around them as they become more certain of where they are. Sora had grown more. She was in the cargo bay, which she occupied now less like a contained creature and more like a resident who had assessed the space and found it adequate. She had stopped scorching things. She had started doing something else instead, something Rail had noticed without mentioning. When he came into the cargo bay, she would shift her position slightly. Not toward him, not away, but oriented, like a compass needle settling. He went down and told them both about the council summons the same way he told them about most things, which was out loud, plainly, as if they understood. Dwin watched his face while he talked. Sora watched the middle distance with her head tilted. We are going to Accord Central, he said. There will be a hearing. People will want to take you away and put you somewhere official. That is not going to happen, but there will be arguing before we get to that part, so I need you both to stay calm. Dwin made a soft sound. Sora turned her head and looked at him directly, which she still did rarely enough that it meant something when it happened. I know, he said to her, though he did not know precisely what he was responding to. I know. The 14 days were not quiet. Soon sent 3 more comm calls, each one more urgent than the last. The Accord's formal inquiry notice arrived via official channel and sat in his message log, unread for 2 days before he opened it out of a sense that ignoring official documents entirely was a habit with limits. He read it. It was written in the layered, bureaucratic language of the Accord, which meant it took 4 pages to say that he was required to appear, and that failure to appear would result in the escalation of the inquiry to an active enforcement action. He closed it and went back to flying. On the 9th day, Vayek made contact. The hail came in on the same tight band frequency as before, and Rail accepted it, and the old warlord's voice filled the cockpit without preamble. The Accord has opened an inquiry regarding the young. I know, Rail said. They intend to claim custody under their containment laws. That is what I understand. A pause. You are going to the hearing. Yes. Another pause, longer. The Draveth do not involve themselves in Accord legal proceedings. We consider the Accord's authority over Draveth matters to be non-existent. He paused again. I am telling you this so that you understand our position. I understand, Rail said. Good. Vayek's tone did not change, but something in the quality of the silence after the word was different. Not softer, just different. You will not be alone in this, Rail, not in the way the Accord will understand. The channel closed. Rail looked at the comm panel for a moment, then he looked at Dwin. I think that was him saying he will be there. Dwin put his chin on the console edge and looked at the stars. Accord Central Station was enormous in the way that things built by committee over many decades are enormous. Without elegance, all function and addition, one section added to the next until the whole thing was the size of a small moon and made about as much architectural sense. It occupied a stable point in a system with no inhabited worlds, which was intentional, neutral ground that belonged to everyone and therefore to no one. The Sundral docked in the civilian bay without incident. Rail walked out with Dwin on his shoulder and Sora moving at his left side, her wings folded, her head level with his and her eyes scanning the dock with the precise, measuring attention of someone taking stock of an unfamiliar space and deciding how she feels about it. The dock workers stopped working. The Accord security officer who came to log his arrival stopped mid-sentence when Sora turned to look at him. Rail checked them in, got his berth assignment, and walked through the civilian concourse of Accord's central station with 2 young dragons and the full attention of every species present, because the sight of a human walking with Draveth young was not something the Accord had ever produced before, and every set of eyes that watched them understood, even without context, that this was outside the normal order of things. Seun met them in the corridor outside the residential section. She was tall, in a formal uniform, with the kind of practiced composure that could survive most surprises. She managed 3 full seconds of composure after seeing Sora and Dwin before it flickered. "They are bigger than I expected," she said. "They grow fast," Rail said. She looked at them, she looked at Rail. She visibly reorganized something internal and returned to her prepared approach. "The hearing is in 2 days. I have prepared a statement for you to deliver that positions your actions in the most favorable." "I will speak for myself," Rail said. She closed her eyes briefly. "Rail." "I will speak for myself," he said again, without heat. "I will tell the truth, in the order it happened, the way I would tell anyone. That is what I am willing to do." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Sora, who was watching her with that flat, measuring gaze. Then she said, "All right," and walked with them, because there was nothing else to do, and because 2 days from now this was going to be in front of the full Accord Council, and she needed to be adjacent to whatever happened next. In his residential quarters that night, with Dwin asleep and Sora settled in the wide space near the window that looked out over the station's exterior, Rail sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what was coming. He had no illusions about the hearing. He knew how the Accord worked. He knew Death's type, the kind of bureaucrat who genuinely believed that order was the same thing as good, and that anything which disrupted order was therefore a problem to be corrected. He also knew what Vayak had said, and he knew what Sora did when she thought he was not looking, how she would turn her head and watch him with something in her eyes that was not the fury it had been in the beginning. He was not a diplomat. He was not a soldier anymore. He was a hauler with a medic's license and a ship that needed new nav relays and 2 young dragons who had decided, for reasons he still did not fully understand, that they would rather be here than anywhere else. He would go in front of the council and he would tell the truth. What happened after that was going to happen regardless of what he said, he suspected. Some things were already moving. He had not started them exactly. He had just been the first person to act, and action, once taken, has consequences that do not ask permission before they arrive. He lay down. Sora exhaled slowly from her place by the window, a long breath, warm and steady. Dwin shifted against his leg. 2 days. He could wait 2 days. The council chamber of the Galactic Accord was designed to make individuals feel small. This was not an accident. The architects who had built it, commissioned by the Accord's founding members 200 years ago, had understood that the purpose of a chamber like this was not comfort, but gravity, the weight of the institution pressing down on whoever stood in the center of it, making them feel the correct size relative to the body that had summoned them. It worked on most species. Rail walked in with Dwin on his left shoulder and Sora at his right side, and the chamber fell quiet in the way that things fall quiet when they encounter something they do not have a category for. There were 31 council seats arranged in a rising arc, and 28 of them were occupied, and every occupant either turned to look or already was looking, because news of what was waiting outside the chamber doors had filtered in before the doors opened. Sora was not small anymore. She was not yet full-grown, that would take years, but she was no longer the size of a large dog. She was the size of a large horse, and she moved with the quiet, controlled precision of something that was aware of its own capability and had decided, for the moment, not to use it. Her wings were folded. Her head was level and forward. She walked beside Rail the way a soldier walks beside someone they have decided to protect, not because they were told to, but because they have made a private determination about it. Death was in the center seat of the upper arc, which was the seat of the inquiry chair. He was composed in the way that senior officials train themselves to be composed when they are not. He looked at Sora and then at Rail, and then arranged his face back into the proper configuration for proceedings. Rail, he said, in the common language, you are summoned before this council under Code 7, Section 9 of the Accord Containment Charter, which covers the unsanctioned possession, transport, and harboring of restricted biological entities. You are not a defendant in a criminal proceeding at this stage. You are here to provide account. I understand, Rail said. Please state, for the record, how you came to be in possession of the two Draveth young currently present in this chamber. Rail told it the same way he had told it to Vayek, in order, without embellishment. He had been running a salvage route. He had picked up a biological signal. He had gone into the wreck and found the hatchlings in a failing stasis pod. He had brought them out. He had kept them because the alternatives were worse. That was all. Death listened with professional attention. When Rail finished, Death leaned forward slightly. You were aware at the time that the field was restricted. Yes. You proceeded anyway. Yes. And when the patrol vessel ordered you to stop and surrender the biological entities, you fled into slip space. I completed the jump, yes. That constitutes evasion of a lawful accord order. I am aware. Death let that sit on the record for a moment before continuing. The Accord's position is as follows. Under the Containment Charter, these two young, as unregistered alien entities found aboard a human civilian vessel without proper biological transport licensing are subject to immediate transfer to an approved Accord sanctuary facility. This is not punitive. It is procedural. The Charter exists to protect both the entities and the species they belong to. Something shifted in the chamber, not a sound, a quality of attention changing. Rail had felt this once before, in a hospital corridor during the war, when something in a room had changed, and everyone in the corridor felt it before anyone inside had spoken. He looked at Sora. She had stopped walking. She was standing where she was, and as he watched, the scales along her neck and shoulders began to glow. It started low, barely visible, a faint blue-gold light running in lines under the surface of her scales, the way light runs under thin ice, the bonding marks. He had noticed them appearing over the past weeks, whenever she was agitated or distressed, but he had never seen them this bright, this visible, this clearly lit for everyone in a large room to see without any ambiguity about what they were looking at. He did not do anything. He did not reach for her. He just stood where he was, and after a moment he put his hand down at his side, open. The way he had learned meant nothing in particular and so did not threaten. Sora did not move toward him, but the glow did not diminish. Dwin made a small sound against Rail's shoulder, a low, steady sound, very quiet. He put his chin down on Rail's collarbone and watched the chamber with his gold eyes. The visual, the glowing dragon standing beside the human, the small one resting its head on his shoulder, was captured by every recording device in the chamber, and those images were on the Accord-wide broadcast feed within minutes, because the chamber's proceedings were public record, and the feed was automated, and no one had thought to shut it off before it mattered. Death was still speaking, something about facilities, something about the charter. Rail heard the words, but they had become secondary to the thing happening in the room, the shift, the weight of it, because 28 council members were watching Sora glow, and not one of them was looking at their notes. Then the main doors of the chamber opened. They were heavy doors, thick, designed to stay shut during proceedings. They opened anyway because the Draveth standing outside them had simply put his hands on them and applied a consistent pressure until the mechanism's resistance became irrelevant. Vayek walked in, and behind him, two of his personal guard who were approximately the size of the doorframes they had just walked through. The chamber became very still. Vayek did not acknowledge the council. He did not acknowledge Death, who had risen halfway from his seat with an expression that suggested he was calculating whether to object and arriving at the answer no. Vayek walked to the center of the chamber floor, stood beside Rail, looked up at the arc of council seats, and waited. Death, after a moment, found his voice. "Warlord Vayek, you are not a registered participant in these proceedings. I must ask you to." "I will speak," Vayek said. The simplicity of it stopped Death mid-sentence, not because it was threatening, because it was stated as a fact in the way that gravity states itself, without argument, without need of confirmation. Vayek looked at the council. "The Draveth do not recognize the Accord's authority over Draveth Young. We have never recognized it. This has not changed. The young in this room are Draveth. They are not subject to your charter. They are not subject to your facilities. They are not subject to your procedures." He paused. "This is not a negotiating position. It is a statement of fact." Death tried again. The entities in question were found aboard a human vessel without. "They were found alive," Vayek said, "because a human entered a restricted wreck alone and pulled them out of a failing pod. The Accord's response to this act is to invoke a containment law." He looked at Death directly. "I find this consistent with what I have always understood about the Accord." Something in the room moved. Several council members shifted. One of the Soredan representatives leaned back in their seat. "The young remain with Rail," Vayek said. "That is the Draveth position. It is not negotiable." He looked at Death. "Counselor, you have ships in this sector." Death said nothing. "My fleet also has ships in this sector," Vayek said. "Would you like to discuss how many?" The silence that followed was of a particular quality that Rail recognized from the war. The silence that happens when both sides of a calculation have been run and one party has received the result and would prefer not to announce it. Death sat back down. "The inquiry," he said, with the careful flatness of a man who has decided that the record should reflect measured composure, "will be recessed for further deliberation." It was not a surrender, it was close to one, close enough. After the session ended, and the chamber emptied in the slow, shuffling way of large official bodies, Rail and Vayek stood in the open floor with the hatchlings between them. Sora's glow had faded. She was standing with her shoulder almost touching Rail's arm, which was the closest she had voluntarily come to him in any space where there were other people present. Vayek looked at her. He looked at the bonding marks still faintly visible under her scales. His face was the same as it always was, controlled and heavy with age, but his eyes were doing something that Rail had no language for. "My elders will argue about this for years," Vayek said. "The bonding marks have never appeared on a Draveth bonded to an outsider. It is unprecedented. There is no precedent in any of our records." "I did not ask her to bond with me," Rail said. "No," Vayek agreed. "That is the part they will find most difficult to explain." He looked at Rail. "I declared you under Draveth protection this morning. The declaration was sent to all Draveth commanders and to the Accord's diplomatic office. There was no formal precedent for extending protection to a non-Draveth either. We added one." Rail absorbed this. "Thank you." Vayek made a sound that might, in a human throat, have been a dry laugh. "It is not generosity, it is debt. The Draveth understand debt." He began to turn. "Your safe passage in this sector and 4 adjacent ones is guaranteed. You will find that certain routes that were previously restricted are no longer flagged in the navigation database." "I noticed," Rail said. Vayek stopped, looked back. The thing in his eyes was still there, the thing that had been there since the night in the small room on his warship when Dwin had climbed into his hand and slept there. He had not put a name to it. He was not sure he would. "You saved the last blood of my son," he said. "There is no debt large enough for that. The protection and the roots are a beginning." Sora made a low sound, not the distress sound, a different one, quieter, with a different shape. Vayek looked at her for a long moment and then answered it in Draveth, a short phrase, very quiet. She turned and looked at Rail. The bonding marks came up again, briefly, just a flicker. "She is telling you something," Vayak said. "What?" Rail asked. "That she chose." He said it plainly. "Not because she was rescued, not out of gratitude. The Draveth do not bond from gratitude. She chose because in all the time aboard your ship, in all the ways she tested you, you never tried to control what she was. You let her be what she was and you stayed." He turned fully away now. "To a Draveth, that is the only thing that matters." He walked out, his guard followed, the heavy doors closed. Rail stood in the empty council chamber with Sora on his right and Dwin on his shoulder, and the recording feeds running in the background, and the proceedings of the inquiry effectively dissolved, and he felt something that he could not have named either. Something in the region of the chest that was not pride and was not relief, but was adjacent to both. He looked at Sora, she looked back. She held the look this time, did not look away, just met him with those gold eyes, flat and steady and ancient even in a young face. "All right," he said, though he was not sure what he meant by it. He walked toward the exit. She fell into step at his right side. Dwin made a satisfied sound against his shoulder. Behind them, the chamber sat empty and official and full of very old protocols, and somewhere in its recording system, the image of a glowing dragon standing beside an ordinary human in the center of the Accord's most powerful room was already in every corner of the galaxy, and the thing it was doing to the way people thought could not be undone. Some images are like that. They arrive and the world after them is a slightly different shape than the world before. 4 months after the hearing, on a long transit through a corridor that had been restricted for 11 years and was now simply open, Rail discovered that Sora had figured out how to open the external hull access hatch. He found out because Dara, who was doing a standard check of the ship's exterior sensor clusters, noticed on the camera feed that something very large was sitting on top of the Sundrel's hull. She came to get him with the particular expression she had developed for situations that were entirely unprecedented and somehow still his fault. He went to the viewport and looked out, and there was Sora, folded close to the hull plating with her wings spread slightly for balance, watching the stars go past at transit speed with an expression of intense, focused calm. He pressed the exterior comm button. "You cannot be out there." She turned her head and looked at the camera mounted on the hull beside her, which was the closest thing to looking at him she could manage through a hull plate. "Zorro." She turned back to the stars. He stood at the viewport for a long moment. She was connected to the ship by a tether she had apparently found in the secondary cargo locker and attached herself, which suggested a level of practical thinking about her own safety that he found both reassuring and slightly alarming. The tether was rated for 4 times her current weight. She would be fine. He went back to the cockpit and checked the nav charts and did not do anything else about it, because there was nothing else to do. When you had a dragon who had decided she wanted to ride on the outside of your ship and watch the stars and had taken sensible precautions about it, the correct response was to let her and check the tether rating and get back to work. Dwin was in the co-pilot seat. He had been in the co-pilot seat for 3 months, for every single transit, and could now accurately identify 14 separate console indicators by touch and had twice made sounds at Rail when a pressure reading had moved into a range that required checking. Rail had no idea how much Dwin understood about what the console did and had given up trying to determine it. He just worked around him, and Dwin worked alongside him, and the nav charts got checked, and the route got maintained, and the ship kept flying. 2 Draveth warriors lived in the rear cargo section now. Vayak had sent them without announcement 6 weeks after the council hearing, with a short message that said simply that the young required supervision appropriate to their standing and that these 2 would provide it. Their names were Gorth and Sen, and they were both larger than the Sundrel's cargo bay was really comfortable with, and for the first 2 weeks they had stood exactly where they had been placed and done exactly nothing else. Then Rail had cooked a meal, a real one, not ration packs, and had set 4 portions out on the cargo bay floor because he did not know their preferences and wanted to offer options. Gorth had looked at the food for a long time. Then he had eaten all 4 portions methodically and stood back up and gone back to doing nothing. Sen had done the same the following evening. Now they ate with the crew most nights. They did not speak much. Sen had once, unprompted, repaired a section of the secondary hull plating that had been developing a stress fracture, using tools from the ship's kit and a technique that Paul watched with his arms folded and then spent an hour asking Sen about through the medium of pointing and nodding. They had worked together on 3 repair jobs since. Communication was largely gestural. It seemed to be enough. Dara had stopped being angry about the hatchlings approximately 6 weeks after the council hearing. She had not said anything about it directly. She had simply one morning brought an extra portion from the galley and set it down on the cargo bay floor near where Sora slept, and then walked out without comment. Sora had eaten it. The next morning Dara brought the same. Rail noted this the same way he noted most things, quietly and without making it into more than it was. Tune had called twice more since the hearing. Once to tell him that the inquiry had been formally closed without further action and that the Accord's legal office had, quote, determined that the circumstances did not meet the threshold for continued proceedings. Once to tell him that a non-hostility framework between the Accord and the Draveth was in early negotiation stages and that his name had come up in the preliminary documents as a catalyst for contact. He had thanked her for the information and told her he was in the middle of a transit and closed the channel, and she had not called since, though he suspected this was not permanent. Vayek had not called again, but 3 times in the past 4 months, on 3 separate routes, Rail had seen a Draveth ship at the edge of sensor range, not intercepting, not hailing, just present briefly and then gone. He had no way to know if it was the same ship or different ones. He chose not to think too hard about it. On the 43rd day of the current route, coming up on the transit point for the Marit corridor, Dwin did something new. He had been watching Rail work through the approach calculations for the corridor entry, which required some manual input because the corridor had been restricted long enough that the nav database had not been updated with the current drift corrections. Rail had been working through it methodically, inputting adjustments, cross-checking against the raw sensor data. Dwin watched for 20 minutes. Then he reached out with one clawed foot and pressed a specific indicator on the console and looked at Rail. Rail looked at the indicator. It was the secondary drift compensation input. He had been about to get to it. He looked at Dwin. Dwin looked back, steady and patient, and then looked at the indicator again. Rail entered the correction. He checked it against the sensor data, and it was correct, within a margin that said Dwin had been watching the pattern of what he did for long enough that he had understood the sequence, not just the motions. He sat back in his seat. He looked at the dragon in the co-pilot's seat, who had been aboard his ship for 4 months, who had watched him do this job every single day, and who had just told him, in the only language available to them, that he was paying attention, that he had always been paying attention. "All right," Rail said quietly, "then let's do this together." He pointed to the next input. Dwin looked at it, looked at the sensor readout, looked back at Rail, and then reached out and pressed the correct adjacent indicator. Rail did not smile, because smiling at a dragon who might not understand what it meant seemed like the wrong register. Instead, he made the same gesture he had used since the beginning, the one that meant acknowledged, noticed, good, that had started as a practical sign and had become something else over time, something that did not have a name in any language either of them spoke. Dwin pressed back into the seat and settled, watching the stars ahead. Outside, Sora shifted on the hull, adjusting her wings slightly, some inner sense telling her the route was changing direction soon. In the cargo bay, Gorth and Sen were eating. Pol was with them, pointing at something in a technical manual, trying to describe a problem he had been having with the port thruster calibration, and Sen was leaning over and looking with the focused interest of someone who finds mechanical problems genuinely engaging. Bren had left the crew at the last port stop, which had been expected and had not been ugly about it. His replacement was a young woman named Fen who had heard, somehow, that Rail's ship had Draveth aboard, and had shown up at the dock with her kit and asked if the rumors were true, and if so could she please have the job because it was the most interesting thing she had ever heard. She was working out fine. Somewhere in the Accord's diplomatic archives, a draft document existed under the title Preliminary Framework for Non-Hostile Relations between the Galactic Accord and the Draveth Confederacy. It was 42 pages long and had been revised 11 times and was currently being reviewed by representatives from 4 species, none of whom were fully satisfied with the current language. In the document's preamble, in a footnote on the 3rd page, was a sentence that read, "The current framework was initiated following an incident in which a human civilian rendered unsolicited humanitarian assistance to 2 Draveth hatchlings found in a restricted debris zone, resulting in the first documented voluntary, non-hostile contact between the species in recorded history." Rael had not read the document. He did not know the footnote existed. He was running approach calculations for the Marit corridor with a young dragon in the seat beside him, and the work was the same as it had always been, careful, methodical, requiring attention. And the route ahead was the same route it had always been, one segment at a time, one transit at a time, one day at a time, and that was the whole of it. Except that it was not the whole of it, because nothing that begins a chain of consequences is ever just the whole of itself. The thing Rael had done in the wreck of a dead warship was still moving, still spreading, still working its way through the galaxy in ways he would never fully see or know. It had started with a scanner signal and a choice made in 3 seconds in the dark and cold, and it had become something that 42 pages of diplomatic language and 11 revisions were still trying to adequately describe. But in the cockpit of the Sundral, on a transit through a corridor that used to be restricted and was now open, none of that was present. There was just the work and the stars and the hum of the engines and Dwin's quiet attention on the console beside him. When the approach calculations finished running and the corridor entry confirmed, Rael sat back and let the autopilot take the transit stretch and looked out at the stars the way he sometimes did, not looking for anything specific, just looking. Behind him, through the hull, he could feel not literally, but in the way that you feel things on a ship you know well, through its sounds and vibrations, that Sora had shifted again. Her weight on the hull was familiar now. The small changes in how she moved on the exterior plating had become a kind of information, the same way a ship's engine note is information, something you learn to read until it becomes background. She was comfortable, that was what the shift said. She was out there in the open dark, watching the stars go past, and she was comfortable. Rael did not know, and would never be told, that the Draveth word Vaic had used to describe him to his elders, the word that had no translation in the common language, the word that had started an argument among scholars that was still ongoing, had an approximate meaning that went something like, one who stays when they could leave. He would not have thought much of it if he had known. He was a hauler, he picked things up. He brought them where they needed to go. He stayed when staying was right. That was the job. The stars came on in the dark ahead of the Sundral, patient and indifferent and vast, and the ship moved through them, small and steady and full of living things that had found their way to the same place for reasons none of them could fully explain. Full of life that should not have made it, and did. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.